So thanks for the opportunity to open day two, the post-gala dinner kind of morning of the conference, and also it's great to be at what I think is a really rather unique gathering of people interested in building and construction in a very broad sense. And while that's really challenging for the people who've got technical expertise to connect with the people who think about broader systems, it's also really rich. So thank you very much to Chris and the Seeds Organising Committee for making it happen and for inviting me. In tackling this topic and offering you this challenge really around diffusion of low carbon innovation in building retrofit, I think the first thing I have to do is just very briefly rehearse the arguments for why we need to think about retrofit at all. Now, this was actually set out brilliantly by Johan in the first paper after the keynotes yesterday morning. But for those of you who weren't at that, effectively the challenge we have in the UK through a combination of statutory targets and the pattern of existing building stock and the rate of new build is that nearly all buildings will need to be zero carbon by 2050, 3 decades and a bit away, and 80% of those buildings that have to be zero carbon are already with us. So we can do brilliant stuff with new build, but it still leaves us a heck of a problem. And plus, reducing energy demand in buildings and carbon emissions associated with energy use in buildings yields a number of other benefits around security of energy supply because we're using less, tackling fuel poverty where those most in need can ill afford to keep themselves warm enough to be well, and as well as climate change adaptation and resilience to a range of pressures. So that's my case for why retrofit needs attention by this group of thinkers. I'm going to now suggest there are 3 vastly oversimplified elements, or elements in a vastly oversimplified system that we need to think about changing if we are to be able to achieve these challenging retrofit targets. We need to tackle technology and materials which are installed into existing builders as a result of specifications in some cases and by installers and building trades. And we need to think then about how those retrofitted buildings are used by occupiers. And to take each of those in turn, I think that the technology and materials bit is in a funny way the least of our problems, in that we know that at least the 40% house is technically possible and you can go lower. There's a huge amount of innovation in building materials and in appliances and how they are configured to use energy for both new build and retrofit. And the number of papers that we heard yesterday really speak to the fact that we are absolutely capable of responding to the technical challenge. Of course, there are the financial issues of getting technology adopted. Those are very real issues. But they're not technological per se, they're broader systems. And there's also the issue about when you can get technical solutions into a building. There are some very specific windows of opportunity when people move in, typically when they change jobs, when they have children and so on. So we need to probably think more carefully about how to match technology with those windows of opportunity. But it is technically feasible. I'd also argue that we know quite a lot from research, although we don't necessarily translate it into policy and practice, about building occupiers and how we use energy. I think this is a really helpful reminder about why, in the context of buildings construction, you need to think about people, because it's not actually buildings that really use energy, it's people that use energy. And there is the shift, again, we heard it from Nauf yesterday, about shifting from thinking about buildings as to thinking about buildings as providers of energy services. So rather than thinking them as black boxes that use energy per se, they provide comfort, they provide shelter, they provide provisioning. They also, and this is overlooked, but it is important, buildings, particularly homes, and offices to some degree, provide identity as well, and they need to, the way in which energy is used needs to reflect the way people want to the services that people want from buildings in terms of identity. And so there's a huge amount of research around energy behaviours, around the motivations and habits and practice theory, how people get locked into particular energy behaviours. This, I've just put in at the bottom there the model, Triandis's model of influencing individual energy behaviours, which was the one that DEC adopted to drive their behavioural policy work. We have yet to see that surface in the BEIS department. But you know, there's a neat menu there of things to go at the individual level around habits, intention, emotions, and so on. I think the other thing that we're just starting to think about from the user's perspective is how we translate away from describing and selling the features of a building. It's really well insulated, it's smart enabled, it's got PV on the roof, and shift that into what the marketeers call selling the benefits of it. A home that is retrofitted for low energy use should be more comfortable, it should be lower cost to run. It may well have different usable space, it may well offer different benefits in terms of identity. Eco-bling and visible retrofit is very important actually in some communities and identities. So I think we need to think about how what can be technologically done. We stop describing technological terms and describe in terms of the benefits provided to users. But really I think the biggest challenge, and what we have yet to really tackle in any meaningful way, I'd argue, is around that middle ground. The fuzzy middle level of the people who specify, install and commission retrofit techniques and technologies. And this is not a trivial sector. In the UK alone, in the focus of my research, I focus on sole traders and micro enterprises who work in private houses. And you'd think, that's fairly niche, Alice. That's a pretty bespoke kind of area to research into. Well, there are around 100,000 people at least working on repair, maintenance, improvement of existing buildings in this country, and 50,000 of them are working actively in firms of 3 people or less, and the majority of those are sole traders. And 2/3 of the homes in the UK are owner-occupied, and typically private owner-occupiers will be using that army of 50,000 people to implement building works in their homes, the kitchen refurbs, the bathroom refurbs, the extensions, the loft conversions, and so forth. So there's a lot of people involved, potentially with a huge impact on private housing, and it's big business. I mean, without kind of putting low carbon constraints around it, the value, it's difficult to really dig into the national figures precisely, but the value of work on repair, maintenance and improvement of existing buildings without it being low carbon is around £29 billion per year. So it is a fair economic prize to go after. And just imagine if we could shift that value of activity into low carbon work, if we made that mainstream low carbon work. So to try and put some resolution on that foggy, cloudy system of specifiers and installers and builders, this is a diagram which, don't worry, you won't be tested on later. It came out of some work I did last year, trying to represent the views of some of those 50,000. Because they're highly fragmented, they're largely ignored, they're difficult for policy to reach. And what all this diagram, the reason I put this diagram up, the key messages are, at the bottom, you've got some supportive frameworks from local authorities, and certainly building control is critical to the way installers behave, and yet, again, a very much unloved bit of local authority work. And national policy, when it feels like it can support positive interventions, but we shouldn't, my current feeling is we shouldn't rely on national policy to drive a huge amount of change in the UK at the moment. And then on the left-hand side of the diagram, you've got a couple of factors which are driving the sector more, the manufacturers and the products that are around, and then the supply chain who select from the manufacturer's catalogues into what's actually available. Or when a builder turns up at Merchants in the morning and says, I need 80 boxes of wall ties, and this is what the architect specified, and the merchant says, oh, we've only got these. Well, you won't get the ones the architect specified if the merchant's only got another set involved. So when we try to put the builders and installers at the centre of thinking about the retrofit system, we realised some relationships were in there that perhaps aren't fully understood and could potentially be shifted. So in the work that I undertook with 7Y Energy Agency and others last year, and some work that I'm now doing with the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford, we've come quite a long way in thinking about or understanding what installers and builders have to offer. They are typically, I'm talking about the micro enterprises now, typically very locally knowledgeable. They understand their area, they think they understand what people want in their area. And that's important because they absolutely depend on reputation and reliability as a way of winning extra work. Now, these are not firms who are particularly into massive economic growth, but they do like a steady stream of work to make sure that they can have the lifestyle that they want, contained within a number of hours that they're willing to work, and still get decent holidays and so on and so forth. So they absolutely depend on reputation to keep that steady flow of work going. They really believe they know client priorities, and it can be very challenging when a client says, do you know what, I'm not driven by price, I really want to have this, whatever it might be, bit of kit, and you have to be, she said, speaking with some personal experience, you have to be quite an assertive client at times to make sure that what you want as a client really does happen. But they do have a really clear understanding of quality, but they mean visible quality, which is actually how most clients of domestic retrofit are interested in whether it looks right. And that's a kind of key. The visibility of retrofit is a really important aspect. One of these things that this army of people do is they solve problems a lot, continuously, in appropriate ways. You know, these are not stupid people in any sense of the word, and they are really, really powerful at solving problems. So again, if the problem that they were solving could be shifted to be more of a low carbon problem, I think we'd see a step change in activity. Because of the local focus, they quite often do develop a niche offering. So, you know, architects who see that are quite often a kind of a town or a series of towns. A local architect would have done a number of extensions, and you kind of get to spot what their style is. But it same applies to builders and other trades, and then there may be a particular technique, a particular technology that they have started to offer, and they developed quite a niche around that. I came across one a couple of weeks ago where a builder said to me, the thing we've got that's different is we're using those joists where you can put the services down the middle. And for him, that was something different that he could offer his client base to say, you know, when it comes back to putting the cables through again later on, you can put them through the joists with no fuss. So interesting stuff there. But trust is a really important in these local networks. Builders, installers sometimes have done apprenticeships. Quite often they learnt from the old man a couple of decades ago. Haven't been back to college since. Maybe they've done some supplier-generated training courses, but really they learn from those they trust, whether in the supply chain or their peers. And there's been some really interesting work about heating engineers published by Faye Wade and team at UCL this year. So we do need to think carefully about, given the importance of trust and social capital, how do you, again, work with that system? Because a technocratic, evidence-based, this is the right thing to do, just isn't going to get anywhere. I think there are a few opportunities as well. I think there is a real opportunity, if we were brave enough to grasp it, around delivering local solutions through those local networks, rather than assuming that technocratically we can decide what's right and filter it down. And I think I'm hearing a lot now about discussion in policy circles about the logbook for houses. so that because we recognise retrofit is probably going to be incremental, probably a room at a time, the kind of whole house deep retrofit, not many people are going to have the cash or motivation to drive that. The idea of a logbook that helps you track changes that are made that might influence energy demand, I think is something that could really work with the way the small builders and installers operate. But really the big opportunity is about mainstreaming. They're already super busy. Anybody who's tried to get a decent builder to do anything on your own home knows there's a 6-month waiting at least in many cases. So they're busy. They don't need extra stuff to do. We have to find a way of making the things that they do already become low carbon activities. But there are some real challenges around that. So what's in particular, I think, what's the business model or how on earth do you make money from going back after commissioning, after the work's complete, and doing corrections, as long as it looks okay and there's no obvious leaks or faults or drafts in the system, most people will kind of live with whatever's happened when they sign off building works at the end of a project. So thinking about actually how the business model operates after commissioning is a really challenge. There is this whole thing about how are you going to spread technical innovation that in a system that relies on social capital, because it doesn't, you won't, if you can be as technically competent as you like, but what you've got to say won't be heard unless you've also got the trust of the people who you're trying to influence. And I think we also need to do this shift towards thinking about what are the benefits of a low carbon building rather than a feature. Most people who want to have extensions built or want some repair work done aren't necessarily interested in the energy aspects. They might want a different room so that a new playroom so that the kids can play but be on the same level as you when you're cooking, or they might want to change the configuration of a space so that the family's together more. Those benefits of retrofit may not actually mention energy at all, and we need to learn how to talk about benefits rather than features. So, in conclusion, my kind of take-home points really are that we can't ignore existing buildings. I'm not suggesting that anybody here is trying to, but they remain with us. And the installers and what are increasingly being called the middle actors or the meso level could be the key to a step change in innovation diffusion if we can get to grips with those business models, provide training routes, both of which work with the grain of how that sector is, rather than trying to shift a highly fragmented sector. I'd say we really need to support local and area-based approaches as well, and we can deliver on benefits rather than features instead of just promising them. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you.